is that the barriers to success are, in a lot of instances, not technical barriers, but they're just issues of collective action, or sort of organization or political will or political expediency.
Okay, so that last one deals with political will to do this, right? Or leadership. Yeah. Okay.
One thing I noticed was there was a lot of emphasis on data sharing between agencies, but I don't understand why there isn't a shift towards that sharing happening when the data is collected. So more of a collaboration during collection, so that when you need to go share it, it's already shared between agencies.
That's a good point. Sorry, I'm writing, so I can kind of summarize.
I think one of the things I was really struck with was the idea of have and have not states. And so it relates sort of to the funding, but thinking about it from a broader equity issue, where the investment will happen and where it won't happen. And then if nationally we're reliant on bottom-up feeding of this data, we're never going to get to a complete picture if there are states who can afford it and states who can't afford it.
I didn't catch that one. Can you say it one more time?
Sorry, concerned about have and have not states.
Okay.
And the implications for what that means for the validity of national data and also the equity issues associated with it.
Okay. Good. Others?
I think it was a question that Karen Mosbacher over here had a little while back about the importance of broadband as being part of the conversation. I think now that we are talking, and we heard about it several times today, about the Internet of Things and the distributed idea that infrastructure is controlled remotely via IP addresses and microwave and various types of technologies, fiber optics and such, that control systems and the kinds of things that are controlled by the internet are probably going to become a very big part of our infrastructure map that we have not talked about too much here. And but we talked around it quite a bit, and that's something that struck me.
Good. Others? There's one over here.
My takeaway is really needing a better understanding of what the mapping of the nation's infrastructure, what the priority is for that mapping, what's on the list, and basically what the ranking is. Because I work for the USGS, and we map a lot of the nation's infrastructure across the nation, and I think it would be helpful to have some guidelines for what priorities there are.
Yeah, that's good. Someone else? That one in the back, Sarah.
So I have heard a lot of opportunities and limitations for the goal that this meeting have, but I think we have to consider, like, the opportunities are all the technological advances that can help us, like crowdsourcing. The other very good opportunity is public and official awareness that this is a problem. Okay. Some limitation in data, like underground data limitation, some limitation that our agencies are not connected, funding limitation. So I think the solution is considering all the opportunities and limitations and do strategic management at national, state, and local level all at once.
Yeah. Okay. Others? I mean, I'm sure we're starting to hit some of the ones that everyone had. I've got a pretty good list here. Anybody else? Tom?
So a couple of my conclusions where there's a lot more useful information there than any of us realize. The presentations that Ed made and that the panel of local governments, I think at the federal level and at the local government level, there's a lot of valuable information. Then take off on what's being said already from Jeff's presentation that came from input from Ron Singh in Oregon, who truly is one of the visionaries in this industry. He's been an evangelist for Federal Highway for years. And that is simply as a part of all owners' projects. If there was a standard schema that they all wrote in their specifications as a deliverable of that project, you would submit, this database information related to that project. They're not going to do that voluntarily. There's money involved with that. There has to be a value assigned to it because they're saying, oh, this will take extra time and effort. What are we being compensated for that? So there needs to be an understanding of that compensation. But then on literally, if a high percentage of all the projects in the U.S., think of the gap we could bridge in the next 5 or 10 years if we were simply asking for digital records on all projects. That's your as-builts, that we all struggle with.
Yeah.
That becomes your asset management system that's current and up to date. It's just a byproduct. That's what Crossrail is doing in London.
Yep, good. Have one over here, Jeff.
Yeah, I would follow that up. Ron Singh doesn't make a big thing about this, but he does believe that autonomous vehicles are going to be serious data consumers. In other words, millimeter, centimeter accuracy, engineering quality of highway as being one of the things that autonomous vehicles use. Because if you only rely on onboard systems, there's a whole bunch of information you don't have. And he's convinced that they're going to need this accurate highway information ultimately.
One of the things that came to mind, turn of the previous century in New York, they called a subway, they don't just call the train the subway, right? The subway is the underground corridor that was built. Then there's a train that was part of that. And it's because they were digging up the streets over and over and over again and kind of realized that ain't going to make sense. They needed to run their Con Ed pipes. They needed to run their electricity because everybody was dying from, electricity wire falling. And they wanted to bury their trains. And there were new construction methods. One of the things that I found, I think I heard it like 3 times today, was, there's been no innovation. Well, that's not fair. In how we think about construction. Right, and how we think about building these cities. And I think, part of our problem is we're literally just digging up another channel in the asphalt, burying the thing, putting asphalt over it, and then the next guy comes in. And there is no systematic notion of how to build the road, how to build that subway as a corridor for all of our infrastructure management. Yeah, the roads are, we're dancing around it here. We're focused on transportation because we know that's probably one of the biggest problems America has, but we also know that all of our other infrastructure is kind of latticed in and out of our transportation. And the truth is that all these roads are actually infrastructure corridors. The road is a piece of it. There's a sewer underneath it. There's a water main buried in it. Somebody buried an electrical thing or put a pole above it. And we're not talking about these things as infrastructure corridors. We're calling them roads. And I think there's a need to shift our vocabulary and our nomenclature to make this stuff tractable both analytically and from a policy and management standpoint. But I also think it requires innovation in the construction, I don't know if construction is the right term, construction engineering world that says these aren't roads, right? We're not calling a paving company to solve a transportation issue today. This is an infrastructure corridor that we're going to manage, and there's many players in how we do that. And I just don't think we use that language, and because we don't do it, we fund more asphalt instead of funding the infrastructure corridor or funding mobility and things like that.
Yeah, good point. I was in China a couple of weeks ago, and one of the gentlemen, is a faculty member here, Sam Ariaratnam, was with me, and he was involved with doing some work in China. Their mega city issue, they're running out of land to go up. They're going to start going down And so, you know, they're mapping underneath cities down to 3,000 meters deep. And they're looking like they're going to be building down to 500 to 800 feet or 200 to 300 meters deep, you know, in the cities. And that's a totally different view of what a city is and how a city operates and what you can do in a city. And I think that's a response to, they have 4 megacities, over 20 million people, you know, to handle that. So that's an issue that, you know, I'm sure that we'll get some traction around here in the U.S. as well. And I think it fits right into what you were saying. It's kind of, we got to re-envision how cities work and how they look. So.
Two words come to mind as I hear this conversation, and it's, we're looking at our infrastructure underneath as uncharted territory.
Mm-hmm.
It's uncharted territory for who's in there and who owns it, who manages it, who maintains it, who designs and builds it, right? I think in terms of getting the data, that's a contractual issue. I mean, public dollars pay for this. Public dollars own the data. So it's a contractual issue where you just write in your contract that you're required to give us all the data. I don't think that's the hard part.
Right.
The part is who's actually the owner of that corridor. When you have so many players, and then is that owner resourced to actually effectively manage that data?
Right.
And I think that's the problem. I mean, just in my project, trying to get data from municipalities on stuff that they already have contracts for was impossible. Going into this area is a whole new area.
Yeah.
So that's, we have to, you know, recognize that elephant in the room is that
Yeah.
we need to know who the owner is and are they resourced.
Yeah. So why don't we shift gears? We've talked through a lot. I'm going to summarize what we said, and then we'll start working on number 2 very quickly. Some of the takeaways that I wrote down: insufficient funds to get to the granularity we need, no clear owner in the Fed space, or who should own this at the Fed space. Fed standards need to be developed for geospatial information, and maybe we incentivize completing or filling that in. You know, the shifting of public and private boundaries in terms of who owns the data. Political leadership is lacking in this area. More collaboration maybe during the data collection process. Concern for the have and have not states. The importance of broadband and the Internet of Things, as far as they're not a part of the map right now, and they probably need to be. You know, what are the priorities in mapping if we can't do it all at one time? You know, what do we prioritize? Public understanding that this is really a problem. Maybe there isn't a real understanding that this is a problem. Crowdsourcing as a potential way of trying to gain some of this data. Trying to get a needs prioritization, and I think that fits back to who's the leadership. More information is available than we realized before we started this journey today and this morning. And, you know, I wrote in there, is there a catalog of this? I mean, have we cataloged this data, these data sources? Probably we need some kind of contractual scheme for every capital project so that we collect the right amount of the right data as we go. Driverless vehicles will be huge consumers of data, so that maybe there's a leverage point there in terms of trying to get more data. Innovation in construction and building in cities, you know, the whole idea of infrastructure corridor and relooking at how we're redeveloping cities. And then we're in uncharted territory in terms of who owns and pays for and all the legal issues of what happens below the ground in many cases. So a lot of pretty good thoughts there. So give it a minute or so and write down a couple of actions here, and we'll talk through the actions. Okay, so there's obviously some good conversation also going on at the table. So why don't we start this, and just realize that probably there are different levels of actions, right? There's the big action, and then there's obviously a lot of sub-steps and other things. So we're kind of looking for the big actions maybe, or maybe a group of actions that maybe can be put underneath and put together with some others. So I guess, would someone like to start on this one? Yeah, we've got one here. Oh, you guys were talking about where to go to dinner tonight, or?
Yeah, we're going to regroup later. The one action that I came up with, because it was discussed here, and I think it's really appropriate for this forum, is formalizing that university partnership.
So formalizing?
University partnerships around the GIS data.
Okay.
I think that's a natural partnership. I'm a big groupie of TRB, been a member for 20 years, chair of a committee. Their research is long. And the challenge we have with TRB is that we actually have more near-term research needs, and that's where universities play a really big role and have a great opportunity. So I'd like to see something developed along that front.
Okay, good.
So John Tucker texted me, the gentleman on the left, who I guess they've closed up, but Mort Downey. So his action was to take advantage, to push for a streamlining of permitting. Smart permitting, i.e., should require mapping the underground as part of getting a permit, right? What's that? Yeah, so timely, making it a timely lever for pushing mapping underground. So I think just the whole notion of streamlining permitting, figuring out what are all the things that need to be included in including the information assets, and then having, I don't know if it's a standard or something, that in every procurement or every work order, that stuff is always included, and then that just dumps digitally straight into the map as the as-built or whatever. So that was Mort Downey's. And then my thing, I think there's, and actually I was writing down, like, as I heard these presentations, there was geographic data, or the map as a resource for operations. I heard a lot of examples for that. The map as a resource for planning, heard a lot of that. And then it starts to blend a little bit, like the map as a resource for figuring out your investment strategy, which is a little different than just planning, right? It's kind of like, what do I budget for over the next 5 years? And then, like, maybe it's further out on the time horizon, the map as a resource for kind of researching alternative futures. And I thought the example from Washington State was great, because they were actually modeling out, like, well, if we invested in this, see how everybody's drive times, decrease, and see how many more people can be serviced by that infrastructure. And I saw a little bit of that in yours also, where that's different. It makes me wonder that if you did geographic data the right way and did the right kind of analysis, is it still a $4.6 trillion infrastructure shortfall, right? Or did you realize that for $1 trillion, you can buy back $2 trillion, because you thought, you're not just burning cash in an operations and maintenance mode, maintaining the same old garbage infrastructure from 150 years ago, you're leapfrogging. And so that my action is like trying to figure out where the map data, this sort of stuff plays into alternatives. I don't know what language you guys use, but like alternative generation, because I think sometimes we've all seen it, go to cell phones over copper line and you just saved Africa $1 zillion on telecom, right? So I think there's a lot of opportunities like that we're not paying attention to.
Good. Another one. We got one.
Yeah, this one may not be popular, but how about a federal law requiring private firms that own huge amounts of data about infrastructure, such as privately owned utilities, are required to provide that data in the national defense? If you think about, for example, where we got our national highway system in the 1950s, that was motivated by national defense. One of the issues, I think it was Derek that mentioned this problem between the splitting. A lot of this is sort of divided between public and private entities. And there's a huge amount of not sharing across public entities, which this could maybe leverage as well, but certainly there's a lot of not sharing between sectors of this data, and so that's an option.
Okay. Others? Yeah. Tom?
So there's a small group here that hasn't been mentioned today. I'm sure Ed from BTS knows about them, and maybe you all do too. It's called the National States Geographic Information Council, NSGIC. It's a small group. Their role is to be a clearinghouse amongst all 50 states. They're always very knowledgeable about what all the universities are doing, what the MPOs are doing, and they actually could be a significant. They've been at this for 30 or so years, and they kind of know a little bit about what's going on in every state related to anything geospatial oriented.
Can you say that one again? I've heard.
Yes, NSGIC,
okay,
which stands for National Geographic States Information Council, I believe. I was active in it a long time ago.
Okay. Others?
Just a follow-up to that comment. There's also the Homeland Infrastructure Foundation level data. That's Highfield. I don't know if anybody's heard of that, but they basically have mapping infrastructure data across the U.S., and a lot of it is in the public domain, and some of it is also private for official use only. So I think there's, in the scope of what everybody's talking about here, there's a lot of overlap between USGS, the Highfield Group, US DOT, and Census. So I would just suggest probably it would be really helpful to scope what data we're talking about, because I would think a majority of this data has actually been mapped by one of those agencies. It's just a suggestion. And definitely USGS has, again, mapped a lot of this, so I think it'd just be helpful to scope this.
So along those lines, Greg, I was wondering if you have any insight as to how much of this might be on data.gov, right? And then U.S. Digital Services can initiate crowdsourced analytics, which I thought was a really interesting perspective. But if what we have is up on data.gov, then that's one way of opening it up to crowdsourced apps and analytics.
Yeah. Okay.
Hey, just quick follow-up on that idea is that I'm looking at the question there is how do we use geospatial information to help solve national infrastructure problems? And that makes me think that maps are so good at engaging the public. They love maps. You go to a public hearing and you see a map and everybody's around the map. They're talking about the map as if it's like a keg of beer or something. They like hanging around the map and looking and talking about the map. And crowdsourcing crowdsourcing getting data in those folks' hands to really play with, I think is a really important aspect of this. And now, follow up on Chris's idea that, where maps have been used as operational management tools and so on, but to use them in a sense of how we are convincing people that infrastructure repair and infrastructure development and infrastructure improvement is important. Using maps and using GIS and using geospatial information to help convince and create compelling arguments for this, I think that's something that the public could get behind pretty quickly that we're not taking advantage of. Obviously, a lot of the regional organizations we heard from are using maps in very effective ways. You see this in presentations all the time. Here's a map of the future, and this is stuff that is, makes geography and geospatial data extremely relevant to people's lives. And it's, I'm not saying it's underappreciated at this point, especially not for people in this room, but I think we could probably leverage it a little bit more than we have.
Good.
So
A real quick funny story. So, so I like maps. I like paper maps. And so I went on a trip with my kids who are millennials, and they're like, "Oh, Dad, that's so old school. Why are you doing that?" And you know, sure enough, we were failed by GPS, and I had the map, and I said, "Here's where we need to go." And they were like, "Maybe I should start taking one of those things with me." So anyway, they don't know how to read them though. That's the problem.
Real quick follow-up is how do young people use maps now?
Yeah.
And that is that they use them in the context of games, in the context of Minecraft, and these sorts of things that people. I mean, it's not like that maps are foreign to them. Paper maps may be glove compartments, yes, but geez, let them have their interact with maps the way that they're used to, and imagine what they could achieve.
Absolutely.
It's a great opportunity.
So this is kind of a compound comment, but on the actions, I think we need to advocate for an inventory of the available data. And I'll just say, I live in Washington, I live around the federal agencies. I love the fact that they do mapping, and it's great stuff that we have. However, it's not built for this purpose 9 times out of 10. It's like a good first sketch of things. And I was speaking at the National Geospatial Advisory Committee 2 or 3 weeks ago, and they were like, everybody was bemoaning that there's simply not enough dollars to do the mapping. Kind of like we heard here. Yeah, I started the mapping, but I can only cover 22 of 50 states. So we have to be clear that just because there is a pretty map that shows something doesn't mean we have the map sufficient to drive a national level strategic discussion around investment in infrastructure. And we are woefully short in funding for the mapping programs for the agencies that we have that do good mapping, right? All of them will tell you our mapping budgets have been declining, and so they have to continue to scope down what they're doing. So I'd say there needs to be an inventory. The other action I would say is, I'm a big fan of, there was an effort during the Obama administration called the National Broadband Map. And the reason I like that was during what was it called? The ARA, the American Recovery Act. In it, they said, we're going to do a national broadband map because everybody, I think there was consensus that there was a massive digital divide. We didn't really understand who had broadband coverage, who didn't have broadband coverage, and there was no way to have a conversation with your commercial providers of broadband coverage because there was no accountability. So they said, we're going to have a national broadband map program. And they did, I'm not sure the mechanism, let's call it block grants to the states. And one of my friends was GIO in the state of California, and he took the federal money, followed the guidance, mapped the hell out of California, and then he got hired to be the FCC GIO, and he got stuck with the job of publishing the national broadband map. And they put together down at the census block group level. I mean, you're talking really granular. They could tell you where T-Mobile worked, where Verizon worked, where your Comcast cable worked, and they actually metered the usage, right? And so when I say like the mapping that we're doing right now isn't purpose built to drive infrastructure investment, it's because we're not developing it at the granularity that we need, nor with the attribution that we need to drive policymakers and people who are appropriators to take action. You can't say right here, these people are chronically underserved by whatever. Because we have no metric. So I want to put the warning out, that just because we have pretty maps that kind of suggest that we have a problem doesn't mean that we have the granularity and the attribution necessary to actually drive action. So to me, a lot of it, they built a framework, and then they even put for wireless, you could download an app for the National Broadband Map, and everywhere you drove, it would sample your carrier and upload it automatically. So it was amazing, right? But that took a little bit of innovation, a little bit of a good technology stack, but it took legislation. It took legislation that said, we're gonna do this. And so I would say that an action should be, we should look into the National Broadband Map, kind of the pieces, how they structured it, and there's some innovation in there, some ways that could be applied to not just transportation, but a variety of other forms of infrastructure, because honestly, it won't be applicable to underground, right? Because my daughter won't run around with her cell phone sampling underground, infrastructure, because the phone can't do that. But I think there's an action in there to explore that analogy and see how far that could take us with certain of our infrastructure shortfalls.
Okay. So why don't we shift gears to the last one? Is that okay? Or we've got one more back here.
Your comments about the process for the national broadband map, I mean, that's right. There was a platform, there were some rules and standards, there was a federal agency coordinating this. It was done, at the state level with block grants. I think that process is something that worked, and so you can go online. I was just looking at it last night. You're able to layer things now. They're starting to layer over health problems with the national broadband map. There are lots of things you could do, layering, infrastructure with demographics for, the discussion about demand. I would say, though, there are a lot of problems with the data. And in a way that's not so relevant to, this discussion about what the process is, but it overcounts what's actually available, because if there's any provider in the census block, it's seen as covered, where, that's a problem in rural areas that may not be covered. They count like 8 providers when there are really 1 or 2. So there's some problems, but that process is something that would be a good model.
Good. All right, so let me summarize what I heard, and then we'll move on to the last one and kind of summarize for the day. I think one is formalize maybe a GIS university partnership for a long-term look at this topic, or partnerships. Perhaps push for smart permitting, the process that's going on now, but also require geospatial information as part of that, so we're collecting as we go. So some action to try to get that done. Realizing that the map is a resource for a number of different things like operations, planning, budget. It also is an opportunity to look at the future, and so can we use that opportunity as a way to maybe push for more budget, because it might in the long run save infrastructure investment. We may not have to invest as much as we thought we did. There was one about perhaps looking at a federal law that requires the private sector to provide information for national defense or national security needs in certain areas. I got several of these, I guess, NSGIC and USGS, and there were a couple of others, but there seem to be a lot of agencies and organizations that are doing mapping, and they're not all sitting around the table with us today, and so maybe there's an opportunity to get more stakeholders to the table to talk, because we may find some more data that we didn't know about. I think we talked about trying to engage the public in crowdsourcing by providing public access to certain types of data, which might be a real good way to do it. Use data and maps in some way to get public support for more resources behind the mapping process. I think that kind of fits with that. Advocate for an inventory of available maps and also the quality of each, so we really don't know what's out there. It doesn't sound like it gets back to that first one, there's no Fed organization that's oversees maps. It's across the board, so maybe there's some leadership issues there. There was a program, ARA program, National Broadband Map. Maybe that's a good model to look at in the future for future things. So those are the ones I had. I know we probably had a few more. So last little thing for you today is the last question. Give your thoughts on maybe 1 or 2 research projects or research areas of investigation that might fill some gaps that we've heard about in this area today. So if you'll take a couple of minutes to do that. Looking at the schedule. Good. All right, I'll give you about another minute or so, and we'll get wrapped up. Okay, so why don't we start again very similar to this. We'll talk real quickly and just kind of ask for volunteers around this and just kind of a research investigation that you think would add value to what we've been talking about. So we have one right here. So Jeff?
Yeah, I think one of the really important things that could be an obvious research project would be researching ways of sharing information from underground locate. You know, I mean, I gave one example where you put 4 GoPros on a backhoe, but you know, it's something that could probably be even done in conjunction with the Common Ground Alliance and some other partners to try that. I believe there's a project along those lines in Chicago right now, which involves every time you dig a hole, you take a picture and you upload the picture someplace. Yeah. And with modern technology, feature extraction, whatever, you can extract a lot of information. And that project that I described, putting on a backhoe, I mean, the idea was to take that and put it into a standard Bentley product called context capture, which allowed you to georeference to other things that you knew where they were, and you could accurately locate that stuff. And a little more work, and you can determine, well, is it a pipe, is it a cable, or whatever. But I think that, I mean, you know, if we say, oh, well, we're going to have a project and we're going to send everybody out to do ground penetrating radar and everything in Boston, is probably not going to get anybody's interest, because they're going to say that's going to cost billions. But if there's ways we can add it to existing construction practices and over time gradually build this thing up, I think that could be a real winner.
Yeah, and also, I mean, GPR doesn't work with every soil condition either, so it's kind of got an issue. Okay, good. Another. Yeah, we got on the back table back here.
So we've seen a lot of maps today. We've heard about maps at the national scale with very coarse positional accuracy, and we've gone all the way down to millimeter accuracy when talking about autonomous vehicles. Every one of those levels of accuracy has an associated cost. It's relatively cheap to create maps of the whole of the country, but when you get down to millimeter scale, we're looking at billions, trillions. So my research question is this: to figure out what aspects of improved infrastructure can be achieved by what positional accuracy of mapping, or what scale of mapping. Okay? So bearing in mind that the scale of mapping is a direct indicator of cost. So how can we improve infrastructure, let's say, on a 10 meter accuracy versus how can we improve infrastructure based on a 1 meter or 10 centimeter accuracy?
Yeah, that's good.
What does it fit for?
Yeah, so it'd be kind of an economic model. Yep. Okay, somebody else. That's a good one. Yeah, we've got one up here at the front table. Behind you, Wayne.
So it seems like we could put together an interdisciplinary group that would define the priorities for infrastructure investment somehow. So I know in 2008, the BICE put together a framework for sustainable and critical infrastructure development. So it's published by the National Research Council. It's a framework, but it's not populated. So it feels like if you kind of agreed with that framework, or at least agreed with the concept of the framework, that an interdisciplinary group could actually sit down and prioritize critical infrastructure investment in this country.
Yeah. Maybe an NRC study group. Yeah. Yep. Others, we got one back here.
I'll rewind one of my rants from the table. So we heard it a couple times, and I've heard it for 20 years in the federal space, you know, where it's folks saying, well, you know, we could have a big database. And they go, well, not one database. And in my mind, you know, that motivation is like, I don't want anybody touching my database, right? So I'll do my database. And they go, well, we'll have a distributed database. And in my 20 years, I've yet to actually see it. This young man has an example in New Hampshire around something. But when we're talking something this big, it ends up being kind of the IT program from hell that never seems to get resolved. There have been efforts around distributed version editing, which may sound particularly nerdy, but like in the world of code, if everybody's heard of GitHub, right, that's been slayed. You've got millions of people collaborating with each other on writing code, which is more complicated than what we're talking about, where you can actually see what Steve and Sally and Julie wrote and when they wrote it, and you can, you know, accept it, or you can turn it back and you can comment on it and collaborate over it. So, you know, there are technologies out there around distributed version editing of geospatial data. And, you know, I think we need to think about the same way the federal government has had, and all governments have had to think about, how do we use GitHub and Redmine and tools like that in our workflows. I think we need to start thinking about that, because I think we are truly going to have our many different databases, but we need to be able to take in real time, not twice a year, our change sets and submit them into the gold master with distributed version editing. So I know that office did it at that time, and then we're going to have to use judgment, right? Do we trust those guys? Is their work ever any good? Stuff like that. But to just operate at the pace that we've been operating at for the past 4 decades and thinking that's going to let us catch up on this massive deficit that we have, I think is mistaken. So, you know, figuring out what distributed version editing on this kind of information looks like and how to do it in a time-dominant fashion is going to be key.
Okay, good. Do I have anyone else? I think everybody's running out of steam. So we had, I think, 4 pretty good ideas. One was research ways for sharing information for underground infrastructure. The example, obviously, are the cameras on the backhoe, and are there other ways of doing that? So trying to capture the data as we go. There are lots of maps, and there are lots of maps at different granularity. And the idea of taking a look at the levels of accuracy versus cost and versus benefit. And I think that's a really neat idea. So if we take it to this level of granularity, how much do we feel like we can do and save? We take it, we ratchet it down, what can we do, and so on and so forth. I think the idea of we talked about priorities a good bit, and I think the idea of putting together an interdisciplinary group, maybe industry, association, administration, agencies, and universities, to define national priorities around the need for geospatial information, so we kind of know a map forward. That's a pretty neat idea as well. And then how to handle all of this data in a distributed form, the idea of big data, how do we do it? And potentially using something like distributed virtual editing technologies or something like that. So, you know, it's putting it all in one database just probably is not going to work, nor would anybody agree to that anyway. So how do we handle all this data that we're thinking we need for that? So some good thoughts out of the whole thing. I think we'll get this in writing and get it out to everyone. I'll give you my overall, my southern overall. What we've talked about today is really important. It can save lives and money. It needs leadership. It needs standards. And it needs collaboration. Does that sound pretty good? So I think that's kind of what I heard from everybody that we talked about. So anyway, I'll turn it over to Jonathan, and thank you very much.
I'm just going to use this, and I'm going to ask Terry to to the first part of our closing thoughts, which I know we will both be brief, I promise.
Having done these a few times, I know that by the time you get to this point, people's brains are just starting to shut down. But that was really an encouraging discussion and a great synthesis of today's conversation. So first, I want to thank all of you who stayed till the end, right? Because we're going to take that feedback and we're going to turn it into a work plan. So that's one. Second, I really want to thank NAPA's collaborators today, Chris Tucker and the American Geographical Society, Wayne and the National Academy of Construction, Jonathan, and ASU. This partnership amongst the nonprofits parallels ASU's partnership amongst their schools, and I think it's exactly this interdisciplinary approach that is going to help us, for a change, move the ball forward. So again, I really appreciate all of you who came to speak, all of you who came to participate, who lent your brains to this effort. We think this is so important in moving forward a critical national priority. So I want to thank you, and Jonathan, thank you very much.
So, first of all, thank you to all the partners that made this happen. I do want to particularly acknowledge Derek Anderson, who really was the sort of point man on all of this.
And Rhonda and her team organized, all the sort of logistics of the event. So thanks, Rhonda.
Yes, if you're talking about infrastructure, you can't overlook the people that actually undergirded the event. But this was not that, it's one of these things usually people say, we've been working on this for 3 years. No, actually it's been a few months that we only had a conversation and we weren't exactly sure what this would be and where it would go. And actually, I didn't get to hear everything, but I got enough to feel like this was a remarkably productive day with really clear steps of what we need to do in order to take this initiative forward and to address the underlying problem. I want to articulate one thing which I think everybody knows, because they've alluded to it, and it's not an engineering problem, it's not a mapping problem, it's not a technical problem. But I actually think the biggest problem, all of the things that people mentioned today all seem incredibly solvable. There's a great deal of technological sophistication, there's all kinds of models to draw from. There's amazing innovations happening every day, and we're thinking about, as I'm just sitting here thinking about, I'm like, we've got autonomous vehicles driving all over the place that are collecting data. We're going to have skies filled with drones very soon, whether they're dropping off people's sandwiches or whatever it is they're doing, all possible to gather data. The technological problems are not the problems. What we have is a crisis of public value. That's the underlying problem, which is an unwillingness. And it's not an R problem or a D problem, to be honest. It's related to partisanship, but it's not purely a partisan problem. There's a lack of willingness and recognition that we have to invest in public goods. And that is, I believe that to be an American crisis. All of us know that the infrastructure investments and the state of infrastructure in other parts of the world are vastly superior to what we have in the United States. It should be a source of shame. And there should be a call to action, and yet there's not. Even when Donald Trump was running for president, he talked about infrastructure, but what has happened since? Not a lot, as was pointed out. And we've become numb to a report card that says D, D, D. I mean, how sad is it that the little green arrow pointing up was next to a D+. That's pretty sad. D+, woohoo! So the reason I mention this is, again, I think everybody here knows that. But here's an uncomfortable reality, which is we don't think necessarily that it's our role as engineers or public administration scholars or GIS specialists to engage the question of public value. But I think that we have to get over ourselves, that we don't have the luxury of letting the public values discourse happen somewhere else, because it's not happening somewhere else. And we as people, and I'm using royal we because you're more the experts than I am, but we as experts need to engage the question of value and why it is that we need to be doing these things and what we are failing to do on behalf of future generations and the public welfare by making these sorts of investments. I think that's a sort of reimagination of what it means to be in this field. And to simply come up with whiz-bang technological solutions or saying there ought to be a law or there ought to be this, that, or the other thing, that's abdicating part of our responsibility in this contemporary environment. And I recognize that to be a change in what we view as our role, but I think it's a change that's required given the reality of what we're talking about. Because all the great ideas that were articulated today don't have much of a chance in the contemporary political environment. To me, that's just the truth. And so we need to get there. I mean, we could go through specific policy after specific policy, and each of you could explain the politics of why these things have gotten stopped here, 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 and here. But it's ultimately on us to play a part in fixing that. So I don't view that as a negative statement. That is to say, I'm not throwing my hands up in the air and saying we're all doomed, don't bother. I'm just saying that has to be part of our collective assignment. But the immediate path is that we're going to operationalize. I think Ed did a great job of summarizing some of the suggestions. We're going to operationalize that. Derek has organized a meeting for tomorrow morning to talk specifically about what we can do, and there's great fodder, I think, that came out of today. And so I'm excited that this is not a one-off, but actually the beginning of an initiative, which is what we hope for, and I think there's going to be great things to come. So thank you to all the ASU participants and organizers who played a role in pulling this together. Thank you again to the partners, and thank you to those of you who traveled to Arizona to be part of this. I think this is an important gathering, dealing with an important subject, and it's going to be the start of something quite significant. Thank you.